In 2010, a potent new synthetic hallucinogen known as N-BOMe emerged on the international recreational drug market. First synthesized in 2003 by German chemist Ralph Heim, 25-N-BOMe was discovered to be a potent serotonin receptor agonist. By 2010, 25-N-BOMe began to appear on the internet. Soon, recreational user experiences were being posted on Earwid, a popular online psychoactive drug and plant library, which has recently described N-BOMes as the defining psychedelics of 2013. N-BOMe is a class of research chemicals similar to LSD, although far more dangerous for reasons of overdosing and death, something LSD makes very hard, and Trip reports of incredibly negative experiences, especially since N-BOMe was being sold and still is as acid, and many people have had terrible trips not knowing what they have or have taken. N-BOMe was made illegal incredibly quickly for a research chemical for obvious reasons, and this has lowered its availability a lot, although not completely, as analogs are constantly being created, distributed, taken, and trip reports are made. On top of education about the drug along with testing kits, the fear of taking N-BOMe is no longer a guessing game if you do things safely. It's incredibly important to test for N-BOMe because a high to mid-level acid trip could be a nightmarish and life-threatening amount of N-BOMe. This is because the probability of paranoia and psychosis and overdose are much higher when taking N-BOMe. Here's part of an interview that Vice did with David Nicholas, who furthered the work of Ralph Heim in 2008 and was a leading contributor to the fact that in 2013, one of the leading causes of bad trips in the entire world was N-BOMes being sold as acid. Just take a look at the increase in Google search trends for the words bad trip around 2011 and 2012, the years N-BOMe were most pervasive on the streets.
No one's died of an LSD overdose, or a psilocybin overdose, or a mescaline overdose, but they've died from N-BOMe. And the question is it an overdose, or are some people just super sensitive to it? And nobody's answered that question for me. So these people are dying, but no one knows.
Could you tell me a little bit about the history of N-BOMe?
It was part of the PhD work of this guy, Ralph Heim. So we just synthesized it and put it into our assays. If we understand what it does, it might be possible to use that same strategy on therapeutic drugs and make them, for example, much more potent or much more selective. So it's not just understanding how psychedelic works. It turned out that a number of things in my lab had made their way into the street drug scene. I was shocked the first time I was contacted by a woman in North Dakota whose son had given some of this drug to friends, and they had died, overdosed.
So you struggle with feelings of responsibility?
I wouldn't say I feel responsible. Someone asked, well, do you have to publish your work? I said, well, that's the paradigm in science. You publish your work so people know. I just feel sad that people make those kind of decisions or do irresponsible things that lead to those kind of tragedies.
Now that we know what N-BOMe is, what it does, how it was made, let's look into some bad trips to see the more personal and negative effects that it can have on someone's life. I would like to point out that everybody in these trips are fine and there was no permanent damage from any of these. Tripped on one tab of 25C, an N-BOMe variant. I think it was 1,000 micrograms, and it started off real well, but after a while it got intense and I had visual and audio loops where I saw the same thing happening twice, and cuts in my visions like things would just slow down and then I'd cut back to normal speed and I would see everything just skip, like when you skim through a YouTube video. I got very weird paranoia and my heart raced to the point where I was worried about my health. I was able to stay strong-minded though and relax myself, which calmed my heart rate. I don't remember much else from what happened, but it freaked me out pretty bad and I wouldn't want to be in that place again. I thought I heard mild auditory hallucinations, but I think it was just due to me being paranoid about hearing them. I snapped out of it pretty quick and paid no attention, so it was like I barely heard anything. Taking a walk definitely helped me keep my composure because the TV was tripping me up too damn hard. I wouldn't say it was a terrible trip, but it was definitely unsettling, and I don't think I'll be doing such a high dose again. Any more of a higher dose, and I think I could have freaked out bad. I was smoking weed throughout the night, which I think made the trip get really intense. I'd recommend saving the weed for the come down because it helps you level out nice and easy at the end. I've decided to take a dose of 0.2 milligrams 25C, and it was probably one of the biggest mistakes in my life. It started well, and luckily I was not alone, otherwise I would have probably killed myself. About 30 to 45 minutes in, the trip started getting so intense that the room was no longer warping and swirling. It turned into an extremely vivid representation of what I can only imagine hell would look like. My friends turned into very beautiful demons, and obviously given the shock of not actually being in a room I thought I was in, surrounded by demons, I fully accept that I was dead. At this point, my friends would look at me, say things, do things, but in my mind, whatever they told me after the trip that they have done was nothing compared to the things I was seeing. As I accepted I was dead, I got scared for my friends and started screaming at the top of my lungs that I was dead, or one of us was dead, what was happening, etc. During this hellish experience, I was constantly vomiting about 4 to 5 times throughout a 9-hour trip, with puke everywhere, also not being able to hear anything as auditory hallucinations kicked in to the point where the music was blasting through the speakers was not any kind of music at all, but rather a faint digital warping sound. I can hear the specific sound every time I take 25C. I mistook liquid soap for water. Luckily, my friends snatched it from me. Eventually, I had to be restrained to the point where I would not be able to move, as I was stuck in a 6 to 7 phrase loop that I apparently said constantly throughout the experience. Visually, it was the most beautiful trip of my life. Though hellish, the rooms and my friends would often warp between demons and angels. The most frightening part was when I could see my head being held by an entity, which I believed was the devil behind me. It was so intense I could feel the warmth of his hands on my head, and at that point, I thought, this is it. Looking back, the N-BOMe took full control. Things I said and done were completely unlike me. My friends literally said it was like they were talking to somebody else. The peak lasted for approximately 6 hours, the longest it's ever been, which most of I don't remember. The way I see it now is that there's no point in trying to do more than you've done the last time, for example. A strong 1 milligram dose will do the trick just right. Overdosing is seriously unpleasant, and having learned that you shouldn't fuck with N-BOMes that hard, it's best to stick with a lower dose. If I weren't for my friends, which were also tripping at 2 milligrams and luckily kept together, I think I would have caused serious harm to myself and rather than others. This was one of my earlier trips. I'm currently undergoing treatment/therapy concerning my mental health, and I believe psychedelics help me in understanding why my mind acts in the way it does. This was on around 1.5 tabs of 25I. I was at a party and I thought my trip on my first tab was coming to an end near midnight. I only felt slight paranoia at that point, but about a half hour after taking the other tab, everything just turned to shit. I ended up sat on the floor in silence for about 20 minutes, and people started to talk about me. Everyone around me started to laugh to each other about how I was acting, which really turned me paranoid. My friends who were tripping with me then went to the local McDonald's to get some food and left me with this psychopath who told me a few hours before that if he saw me in the streets, he'd beat the shit out of me. He said that whilst I was tripping pretty hard. So I tried to go and find my friends. Keep in mind that the McDonald's was half an hour walk away, and after 5 minutes of walking, most of my personality collapsed in on me. I ended up having a panic attack, wondering why I couldn't remember who I was or why I was there. I assuming this was ego loss, although in addition to this, I ended up sitting in a nearby field talking to myself for a while as cars passed me. My mind turned to a blank, and all I could feel was terror and confusion for a long time afterwards. Towards the end of the party, one of my friends came back with my ex by his side and found me running down the street. They sat me in front of someone's garden and tried to calm me down. They had failed to do so, and I left in the same state of fear and panic as I started with. My friend, who was meant to be my sitter for the night, looked genuinely afraid of me and left me to go home. I called one of my friends and asked to stay at his that night, as I was afraid of what I would do if I was left alone. My movements were erratic, and after I arrived at the designated meeting place, my thoughts came back full force, barraging me non-stop words that I couldn't even piece together correctly. I had a lapse in memory again, and at this point, my friend who was meeting me found me on a bench in the corner of his local park, shaking with a frozen in fear look on my face. He walked me to his humble abode and tried to reassure me that everything would be fine. But for months after that trip, I had terrible thought loops and frequent moments of pure fear flooding me. I've read up that marijuana and N-BOMes both affect certain parts of the brain, which explain why my weed highs since that trip are plagued with severe paranoia throughout. My friends, too, have mentioned that I act differently since that trip. I believe I approached psychedelics with a certain naivety about me, and I treated them with a complete lack of respect. I realize now what a grave mistake that was, and even though that trip was bad, it helped me learn certain things about myself that I knew before but couldn't pinpoint exactly, if that makes any sense whatsoever. The takeaway from this video is, test your shit. N-BOMe's no joke, and I would never ever suggest, nor would I ever do it personally, ever. I hope this video has given you some insight into what the drug is and how it affects people, and I really appreciate you guys checking this video out. And if you're still here, please subscribe and like. Thanks.